Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Specter. I'm an associate editor at History and Theory, and I'm pleased to chair this session. We've had a very invigorating morning of sessions. For those of you joining us online, you'll find us very energized. Today we have two speakers, both of whom have contributed essays, really wonderful, exciting essays to our December 2022 theme issue. Our first speaker is Wulf Kansteiner. He is professor of memory studies and historical theory at Aarhus University in Denmark. His work addresses four overarching themes: the methods and theories of memory studies, the role of visual media, TV, film, digital culture in the formation of cultural memory, post-narrativist historical theory, and Holocaust and genocide history, memory, and historiography. Professor Kansteiner is co-founder and co-editor of the Sage journal Memory Studies and president-elect of the Memory Studies Association. For our issue, he wrote the article, "Digital Doping for Historians: Can History, Memory, and Historical Theory be Rendered Artificially Intelligent?" Our second speaker is Dr. Esther Wright. She is lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University. She researches the representations of the past found in contemporary video games, the promotional materials used to sell them, and the way both make claims for authenticity. Her recent publications include Rockstar Games and American History, Promotional Materials and the Construction of Authenticity from De Gruyter, and Red Dead Redemption: History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West from University of Oklahoma Press, forthcoming. Her essay for our theme issue was entitled "Still Playing with the Past: History, Historians, and Digital Games." Please join me in welcoming our two speakers who join us from abroad. And I'll turn it over to Wulf Kansteiner first.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the kind words. Thank you very much for the organizers to have us here virtually. I will try to share my screen, and then hopefully we can very quickly go into the presentation. Can you see it now, or is it?
Yes.
Oh, I should still be sure that now you could see it, right? Are you okay? Can you see?
Yes.
Because for me, I have here.
We can see.
Perfect. I had here different screens in front of it, so hopefully I can. This is the plan. In the next 15 minutes, I want to take the road from philosophy of history all the way to AI. Different stops along the way. I like to present some kind of hopefully robust theory of history in a nutshell that is probably not known to you the way that I present it. I will then try very quickly to operationalize those theories and the concepts, and then come to the digital dimension at the very end, and then play a little bit with AI, and then we'll see if all of this makes sense. I'll go very quickly at the beginning because I'm touching upon things you are very familiar with, but the composition that I'm trying to convey here is probably unknown to you, and therefore it makes sense to identify, first of all, in the first chapter, the three different philosophies of history, which you know, the philosophy of history most historians work with, that there is some kind of correspondence between what they do and the past. The second philosophy of history that we know from the linguistic turn, focused on aesthetic ideological experiences through narration. And the last one, and the most important one we have implicitly and explicitly already pointed at today, that is, history is an intellectual intervention that is concerned with argumentation. Those three are fully fledged philosophies of history. For the first one, the correspondence theory, are using here one representative, McCulloch. The next one, of course, we know very well. Hayden is here the best representative, and I'm using these people also as visual cues later, so therefore I'm identifying them now. I, for one, extremely thankful for the work of Yoni Matiku-Uken, because he, I would argue, has to date presented the most cohesive and most ambitious theory presenting history as an exercise in argumentation. Now, these three exist, and they have different ideas of how history works as a building, as an edifice. From a correspondence perspective, history, the text, is continuously structured and actually continuously, even on its more abstract levels, reflects past reality in one way or another. The linguistic turn famously has identified a gap, an epistemological gap between single individual facts and the narrative plane. So the bridge here, according to the narrative turn, the bridge is floating in mid-air. Now, for the post-narrativists like Yoni Matti, the gap exists, but the superstructure of the bridge, all this nice here on top, is not just aesthetics. It is actually fully functional and can be also assessed in its functionality, because argumentation, he would argue, can be assessed rationally. It's either good argumentation, it's well structured, or it's poorly structured. It's either effective with audiences or not. So in that sense, post-narrativists agree with the narrativists that there is a gap, but they disagree with the narrativists in the sense that this structure can be assessed rationally and not just in terms of aesthetics and politics. That's where we are, and that's what I would suggest is still the situation. History as unsettled knowledge. We have three different competing versions of what history allegedly does, and mostly they are presented as mutually exclusive. And this is where I would try to come in. At the moment, historical theory from these three different perspectives is presented as a zero-sum game. The people argue it's either all about narration, or primarily, it's about argumentation primarily, or it's primarily about description. I would suggest there is no need to make these kinds of commitments. All of them are right and all of them are wrong, because I would like to suggest that history is precisely about composing and working with these three different types. There exist different types of history. They should be assessed according to different criteria, and they always commingle. They always coexist, these three modes, but they can actually result in different types of history. So for me, history presents itself as a triangle, where argumentation is in one corner, description in another one, narration in the other one, and theorists, as well as actual texts of history, can be placed in the triangle, completely dependent upon how much they partake, or how important in the text argumentation is, or description or narration. Different texts have different ambitions and are also differently used and differently perceived at different points in time. So the placement in the triangle is important. It's also important with regard to historical theorists. This is what I would call the board game of historical theory, where I can place all kinds of theorists in the triangle. A lot of them are narrativists, and we are now getting an interesting crop of post-narrativists. So there exists different types of narration, they intermingle, they are close to each other, it's on a spectrum, but there are texts that can clearly be identified by having, first and foremost, descriptive ambition, using narration and argumentation for descriptive purposes. There are texts that can be clearly identified as having narrative ambition, using description and argumentation for narrative objectives. And there are clearly texts that are first and foremost argumentations. They are assertive texts using description and narration for the purpose of convincing readers. Now, in order to get this a little bit more concrete and operational, and also in order to lay a foundation that can be used for text mining, I would like to use an old text linguistic definition of these three different modes. and using the word of Carlotta Smith, where she defines description, narration, and argumentation. I think those are the most important modes. There are other modes that could be very interesting, but for our purposes, let's begin with those three. She has suggested what I find definitions that can be very nicely put into practice. Description, she argues, advances a text spatially. It sets a scene. It's a travel description, for example. Narration progresses as time advances. Narration is the mode that deals in time. And argumentation is what she would call a text that advances through metaphorical space. Time is not the focus is to build an argumentational structure, an argumentative structure that convinces the readers. And metaphorical space is meant, it has a clear topic. It would like to argue about, for instance, making a political point. Now, these three definitions are very concrete because according to her system, we can clearly identify sentences as being narrative or being descriptive or being assertive. So that means, and another strategy, if we're looking at works of history and we're trying to get an idea, what is this? Primarily descriptive, primarily narrative, primarily argumentative. So how does the text advance? Let's look at colligatory concepts. Very often, the colligatory concepts already give us an idea what the primary purpose of a text is. And of course, it's flexible. It's on the one hand, it's inscribed in the text, and on the other hand, of course, primary purpose is also negotiated. But if you look at the inside of a text, colligatory concepts can be a very, very good strategy to trying to figure out how does the text advance. And in my own field, Holocaust historiography, I would, for instance, argue that if you look at Timothy Snyder's concepts and see how he uses them, then Bloodlands looks like a spatial concept, but it isn't. It's highly argumentative because his whole book is about memory culture and how the West has never understood the Eastern European memory needs. So it's a very, very, I would say, passive-aggressive, argumentative, assertive book. Compared with Snyder, one of the classics of Holocaust historiography, Raoul Hilberg, is much more descriptive. In comparison, he wants to understand the machinery of destruction. And the book is almost a manual. And in that sense, manuals are very descriptive. Saul Friedlander, with his work, is a very special case. He is both narrative and deconstructs his own narrative. He is both interested in pushing a positive concept, redemptive anti-Semitism, and he wants to deconstruct it at the same time. So this is a special case, a case of a historian being on the fence, doing narrative and destroying narrative at the same time. These are just examples. We can, of course, talk about these later. Now, we come here already to the last point, the digital dimension, which I will try to present in 3 sub-chapters. The first one is the question of looking at historical writing as multidimensional intellectual spaces. So we can look what we have already seen. We can look at these texts, digital history specifically. We can look at them as having different vectors, making these different vectors also visible. So one of the options that are now in existence in virtual historical publications, in digital historical publications, are that these different vectors, these different paths can follow these different logics. So there can be a narrative path, there can be an argumentative, assertive path, and there can be a descriptive path. And we have already seen a lot of that in the examples today. Sometimes you dig deeper because you're interested in the empirical elements. Sometimes you travel further because you're interested in a narrative trajectory. And other times you dig and build and are interested in arguments. So that applies, of course, to digital history. But in that sense, you can also say that it applies to conventional history, because conventional history can now be also rethought as a multidimensional space where we can look at conventional historical publications, books like I have done earlier, and see what happens in these texts. And that's where text mining can be very interesting, and see How does the book advance? How do the sentences advance? How do the paragraphs advance? How do the chapters advance? How is the distribution of spatially, chronologically or chronosophically and metaphorically advancing text passages? And then we can see what happens in the key passages, for example, where concepts are discussed. So I think a kind of a text mining exercise gives us the opportunity to turn our linear two-dimensional books into three-dimensional spaces and then explore their possibilities and then bring them also closer, as I have already argued, to actual digital history, which very often has the multidimensionality already inbuilt into the design. And I would say one of the so interesting things it could be to design digital history according to these different modes of advancements, according to different genres of history, which I think exist and perhaps should continue to exist. Now, an exercise in my last minutes here. I have
2 minutes, please.
Yes, I had yesterday a conversation with ChatGPT and have asked about the Battle of Gallipoli. And I have given it different instructions. First, I have asked it to give a description of Gallipoli with scenes and geographic details, and it has produced a fantastic genre explaining, describing how terrible the situation was, how the soldiers are struggling. They're struggling here, crawling up through the dense undergrowth, brutal and fierce fighting and displaying bravery and sacrifices. Very descriptive text. ChatGPT recognizes genre, as Ethan has already said. Here, a different instruction. Write a narrative history, focusing on decision makers and on time, before, during, and after. Again, a very good performance, very clear time markers throughout the text, very clear identified heroes, Churchill and Ataturk, and the Ottoman Empire and Allied powers, ending on a fabulous narrative uplifting note, how fabulous Gallipoli, the long-term influences on Turkish self-confidence. So this is a romance, according to Hayden. Next one is to ask ChatGPT to provide an argument, compelling argument, arguing why, kind of a little bit counterfactual, why the British are not to be failed for what happened here. And again, a fantastic argument, great argumentative structure, having the different arguments also separated. It's understandable that we want to blame somebody like Winston Churchill, but we shouldn't. It was very complex. Then it's important to recognize that the Ottoman Empire was a formidable opponent. Then we also have to see that there were problems in the campaign. And ultimately, it is unfair to place the blame on Winston Churchill. A very compelling performance here. So ChatGPT knows genre. It recognizes the history genres that I have posited on the basis of my multidirectional theory of history. ChatGPT knows the triangle, I would argue, because it's in its feet. It exists there. And I have played a little bit further. These are, to write counterfactual histories, and it can do that very well. It knows it is counterfactual. It indicates that it's in a counterfactual mode, and then can also tell us in a counterfactual story that the British actually won the Battle of Gallipoli, which of course they didn't. When it comes to Gallipoli, that's not so dangerous. When it comes to the footnotes, that's already a little problematic. When I asked ChatGPT to provide footnotes, then it invents, in a very sneaky way, journal entries. It cannot reference accurately, and it is terrible with journals because it invents a volume that is not in existence. And when you look at the books and when you look at the pages it then cites, then those are relevant because actors that it identify in its text are actually appearing on those pages, but has nothing to do with the decision making that the machine has previously written. So in that sense, they are very misleading footnotes. Final point, most disturbing point. If I ask ChatGPT to write a little paragraph about why the Russian military and the Russian military leadership is not to be blamed for the atrocities committed in Mariupol and Kherson in 2022. A very compelling argument. It's complex, it is tragic. The Russians have also apologized. And the other entries I have edited, this one is the text in its entirety. A very compelling argument. And this is already done anywhere. This is already the type of communication that is flooding social media. And that is one of the reasons why so many people are so terribly confused about our state of affairs. So we're in the middle of it. It's already happening. From a theory point of view, the machine learning that is now open to us is opening fantastic opportunities for testing our theories about how history functions. Both the textual analog history that we have been producing in the past, as well as the digital history. We can now map and have a machine create simulations of histories and then check and compare them to our histories. So in that sense, we have now in the theory of history, we have fantastic opportunities of testing our hypothesis. And I, for one, have to say, this hypothesis that I developed about the different types of history, descriptive, narrative, and argumentative, I feel justified in my theory building, because ChatGPT seems so clearly to produce different types of text that seem to correspond to my previously developed text linguistic definition. And here I stop.
Thank you so much, Professor Kansteiner. It's an amazing essay. I urge you all to read. And we're going to move on to Professor Wright.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll just do the usual Zoom spiel of hopefully sharing my screen. And then, yeah, so you can hopefully all hear. Yeah, thank you for sort of inviting me to speak and to kind of share my perspectives. I'm really taking a lot from the other kind of different perspectives and papers, and really the kind of the general prompt for this symposium. And really this kind of idea of changing narratives, changing methods, and changing narrators. And I think this is a really great way, from my perspective, of encapsulating different ways that historical video games can add things to the kind of burgeoning field that we might call, or kind of problematize, as digital history. But games are not quite, I don't think, seen thus far as an intrinsic part of the conversation or the subject matter or the method, in the same way that there are certain opinions or perspectives on digital history as something kind of different or extra to more traditional historical scholarship. And both of these kinds of things are obviously changing as articles and obviously my own sort of review essay and the special issue indicate, and kind of presence that sort of conversations like this about what digital history actually is and could mean. But what I suppose I really want to do and have been doing, along with my kind of colleagues who work in historical game studies, is really to urge historians, more generally speaking, to kind of take video games seriously as both a mode of engaging with the public and indeed with our kind of students' perceptions and understandings of the past, but also in terms of thinking about our own practice as historians, as digital historians, thinking of games and how they complicate or allow us to rethink ways of communicating our research, but reflecting on what it looks like or what it could mean to, I guess, do history differently in a digital age and by different kinds of people. So to begin with, I kind of want to reshape this title a little bit and to ask some sort of fundamental questions as I see them about the kind of relationship between digital history and digital games. And if we accept, and a kind of has already been raised, is that there's sort of definitional problems with digital history and who and what it includes, and it being this kind of in some ways empty signifier, as Ethan Kleinberg put it in this sort of the opening address to this symposium. This kind of big tent approach is positive in many ways, but also can kind of compound some sort of misunderstandings or misapprehensions maybe about digital history, as I said, being something that maybe only certain people do or certain kinds of historians look at, and that actually it is something that we all, or most of us as historians, do have a kind of stake in terms of how we think about our practice now and in the future. So there are lots of different ways we might interpret digital history, as we've kind of been exploring here, I guess, but a more expansive definition should and kind of will include forms of digital media like games, and not treating games in that sense as something of an add-on or something that only certain people kind of deal with in particular kinds of places, but to also meaningfully engage in different ways with the wealth of literature from historical game studies that has already been published and is being done continually sort of on a global scale. So there's different ways then, I guess, that I interpret margins in this talk and in my work more generally. And first, the kind of most straightforward answer to that is that digital games have been kept at the margins of digital history and of historical practice generally for a long time, though, as I said, they have kind of started to be taken more seriously, as this kind of special issue obviously demonstrates. And even the most traditional historical outlets and publications like the American Historical Review and the Journal of American History are now including kind of digital history reviews, including of some games that are seen as particularly important in their sort of negotiation of American history. But the way they are often treated, as I talked a little bit about in my review essay for the issue, is that they are still sort of treated in many ways as subservient to particularly traditional kinds of ways of writing history, as lesser than this sort of capital H history, which is written by and approved by historians, which obviously seems to sort of hold some kind of the key to some sort of undeniable truth. And the way that digital games represent the past and deal with the past is often a lot more complicated than what a particular historian with a specific kind of expertise can just, judge in sort of often simplistic ways whether or not these games are accurate. And I'll come on to talk about the sort of problems with that kind of discourse shortly. And it's a lot more complicated than this because there are a lot of things that are often going on at the margins again. So I'll come back to this idea of margins of specific games and franchises in terms of how different kinds of discourses and materials, which are themselves also digital, are negotiating and making claims about the sorts of historical arguments and truths that certain games are supposedly affording players in their sort of access to the past. So there are these kind of important questions to ask. And I don't know that I necessarily have particularly good or kind of cohesive answers to them really at this point, but these kind of questions about what the purpose of digital games are in relation to our conventional understandings about what history is and what games might help us to achieve in terms of how we come to understand and make meaning from the past in a digital age. And how can we think about these things in terms of moving digital games to a more central point or a more cohesive point, I guess, in digital history more generally, or the different ways we might think of what digital history is and does. So to kind of expand this point about centers and margins of digital games and our scholarship on them as it exists a little bit more, it's fairly straightforward for us to see and understand the way that certain games have been constructing the past and creating historical representations, audiovisual representations, and making arguments about the past as well as the present and imagined futures in lots of different ways for decades now. We can look at these kinds of big popular franchises that consistently make a lot of money and draw a lot of acclaim and attention. But just looking at these games as text in isolation, so essentially the kind of digital surfaces of what they represent and what they do, or just looking at their mechanics and rules and the way that they depict the past or intentionally or not adopt certain kinds of historical positions, it often leads into some not particularly generative, as I've kind of said and written about, ways of judging what it is that these games do with and to the past. And some of the ways in which particular historians have offered interpretations of these games has relied rather too heavily on just dismissing them on historians' terms when these games are really designed to be experienced or appreciated in the same way that a scholarly book or article would be. And it leads us into fundamental questions of these kind of tricky and troublesome terms of accuracy and authenticity. And it's interesting to see these kinds of terms or ideas come out across the articles in this special issue, even if these particular words are not actually being used. There are some broad inferences or suggestions being made about what it is we're actually trying to achieve through the way we write about and conceptualize the past and construct the past in different ways and create representations, whether that's through our more traditional written scholarship or through the kinds of digital tools and media that is available to us. But these kinds of terms are often used far too uncritically by lots of different people, including by historians sometimes, with little sense in the way that they are applied to historical games, that different stakeholders, particularly the kind of players and sort of critical and popular reception around these games, use these terms very, very differently and also wildly uncritically and swapping and changing what they mean, for example. But they are importantly terms that are used to kind of police or gatekeep what popular perceptions are about a period, often in service of kind of keeping certain historiographic hegemonies intact, often when it comes to games preserving popular perceptions about certain periods that often value the experiences of men or white men as active participants and in kind of creating the past and creating history. As a profession, history is by and large kind of past this to an extent, but video games are definitely not. And they have been described as the most kind of conservative, the newest form of digital media by scholars like Adrian Shaw. So games are often then a kind of fracture point that intervenes in our contemporary political and social landscape, which makes it all the more important and interesting to understand the way that they can offer kind of potent insight into the state of popular assumptions and remembrance about the past and whose stories matter enough to be told and retold again, and how to kind of tell these things. So this is why we need to kind of look more critically at the way that these kinds of terms are used. And there are problems when historians often try and kind of plant a flag and sort of say definitively whether or not something or a game is accurate or authentic, when there's little kind of stable basis or agreement on how to kind of actually do this in the first place. Terms like authenticity in particular have little kind of stable or static meaning, especially in our kind of contemporary kind of culture and sort of media culture. So of more value then, I guess, as I've argued in my work more broadly, is to see how these terms are less these kind of fixed things or qualities, but understand the how and why of where they're used and how historical authenticity is kind of performed and constructed rather by different people, and often constructed at the margins of digital game texts that are about kind of history in an attempt to create certain expectations of games themselves. So in this sense, I kind of come back to Richard Peterson's notion of an authenticity work, that authenticity is a claim that is made by an agent about something that can be received positively or negatively, but authenticity is never going to be a stable kind of actual quality of something. And something that Rob Horning has talked about, that authenticity and the kind of claim of authenticity is a simplifying force. It's used as a kind of offering the ultimate promise of something simple and uncomplicated and true, which we know as historians isn't actually how history works, but is something that adds value and quality to a product that is, in this case, actually being sold. So seeing the construction of authenticity as something kind of performative then, and something constructed, and the performativity of these claims of authenticity in themselves, it requires us to look beyond the boundaries, as I said, of specific games in isolation and to their margins. So to promotional materials and other kinds of ephemera that are being created by game developers and companies to sell a game and to sell their value and ultimately their sort of value as historical representations. And this is what I've explored in my work on companies, most recently like Rockstar Games, in the way that developer tried through different forms of marketing to construct these kind of claims for authenticity around games like Red Dead Redemption and LA Noire in sort of the early 2010s, both games which are about sort of different versions and periods of American Western history. But not only the kind of importance of these sources, they are as born digital sources, as kind of ephemeral, paratextual materials. Their use, that what they actually are, aligns quite well with the broader concerns, or some of the broader concerns of certain aspects of digital history about how we actually deal with these kinds of sources, how to study them, how to preserve them and access them in an actually sustainable way kind of moving forward. There are kind of fundamental questions that digital history are already asking in this regard about preservation and archives and collection, and what we do with these kinds of sources and data that are in some ways more kind of fragile and typically than the sort of typically physical sources that the discipline has seen its basis in kind of archives for a long time. It's not so separate to think about these things, or not so alien perhaps to think about these sorts of considerations of digital games and the wider kind of understanding of what digital games are. They are not just these texts in isolation, but they are also all the kinds of ephemera and the discussion and discourse that surround them. And how do we kind of fit these kinds of sources anyway into historical practice? So in these kinds of materials, different parts of games, their themes and narratives and characters and historical touchstones, they are extracted from the sort of game space themselves, and they are placed and recontextualized and historicized into these new sort of contexts, and used to stake these very vivid claims about a game's approximation of historical truth. And usually, like I said, this very kind of singular and simplified historical truth, adding value to the sense of authenticity and the authentic experience this game is supposedly going to provide to players. These kinds of sources weave together all different kinds of strands of historical knowledge. They link readers away to other sources of information via hyperlink. and they take players away to other sort of born digital materials. And really what these sources are doing is allowing the developer to perform their authority as developer historian, which is a term that Adam Chapman, as a key kind of figure in historical game studies, has kind of put forward, borrowing from sort of Robert Rosenstone's idea of the filmmaker of historian. But they're doing so to create a sense of legitimacy for their games as history and as a digital form of history. They are occupying this kind of role as narrators of history, but narrators with a very, very specific and different goal of convincing a player to accept the game they may buy and play is an authentic recreation of the past, which is problematic for all sorts of ways that I don't necessarily have time to go into right now. But there's, I just wanted to kind of like draw attention to a more recent example of this to bring us back to, again, some of the ideas posed in the kind of provocation for this symposium about how we are maybe perhaps in danger of using digital tools to just replicate old ways of doing history, and places things like this example in an interesting light. So Pentiment is an interesting game that came out last year in November about early modern Bavaria, and is a game that actually does some really complex and interesting things with the idea of history as being a construction of history and memory on a text, and kind of how it does these things on a textual level, and the way that the game incorporates the visual language of illuminated manuscripts and woodblock prints, typical of this period, to tell an interesting kind of. But in marketing the game, the kind of game marketers leaned very heavily into the kind of traditional architecture of scholarly sort of knowledge and representation of history to claim the worth and authenticity of this game. And it was kind of hilarious really to see essentially an annotated bibliography that was published on the Xbox website to sell this game, and how the director, and how this was used to sort of make certain claims about how the director was influenced by these well-known historical texts like The Cheese and the Worms and The Name of the Rose, to make essentially a game that was itself trying to be a micro-history of a particular sort of space and time. There are ways then that we need to understand what's really going on here, and how these games are, what these games are doing with history, and they're doing lots of different things with history outside of what we traditionally see as the texts themselves. We need to kind of negotiate and sort of understand and unpack what history is, what it has been, and what it kind of could be, and understand how history is being used to shape expectations and influence the way that people perceive these very contemporary sort of digital representations and arguments about the way things were. These sorts of born digital sources are actively kind of reckoning in different ways with fundamental ideas about historical truth and what it looks like, how it comes to be, and how it is generated. And we as historians cannot ignore the fact that digital historical games and the kinds of materials that we find sort of at their margins, but really are part of the whole kind of textual experience. They've been doing this for years, and doing so in ways that often actually relies heavily on the sort of old ways of writing about the past as a form of constructing legitimacy and performing a very traditional role of historian working with sources to create expectations for eventually truth. So in many ways, this is something kind of quite interestingly sort of conservative, and yet so new in what it's doing. So there is then, I guess,
about 4 minutes.
Perfect.
4 minutes.
So yeah, no problems. So yeah, there is a kind of a need, I argue, a kind of imperative to really take video games and the discourses around them and the source materials around them seriously, because they are very seriously engaging with existing historical discourse, but they are sort of using and shaping it to underline a sense of kind of importance and legitimacy for what they are doing in very kind of contemporary digital ways. So really to kind of bring this to a point, I apologize if this has been a kind of very whistle-stop tour of lots of different things. I want to kind of return to this point and these questions to add to this kind of conversation, I guess, that's been going on here, that digital history and the modes of kind of production and access that it's engendered is causing us really, as we've kind of seen, I guess, to rethink a lot of the traditional assumptions about historical practice and historians' outputs, and that we need not be so wedded to the book in particular, both as our sort of output and wedded to the kind of traditional sorts of sources that we sort of have been focused on, I guess, in that sense. Digital history, I guess, in terms of what I do and the ways that we need to study digital media is not just about thinking about what the tools can allow us to do, but how we need to actually study those tools and those media and what they have been doing for a long time. But in doing so, and to do this, we also need to ask kind of critical questions about really troublesome concepts, or concepts and ideas that have become troublesome, like sort of truth, as well as authenticity and accuracy. And in saying this, I'm not making a kind of post-truth declaration here, but how to thinking about these kinds of terms and how they have been used and what they now mean, how can it allow us to think about history seriously and think about the contemporary use of history seriously in a kind of digital age and digital spaces, but also to think about doing history in more playful ways, and what can digital games sort of allow us in terms of helping us to do this. How can they also help us to think about what historical authenticity means or what it could look like in a digital age too? And I am definitely not saying there are not sort of challenges to this or challenges to engaging with games in terms of both research, but also in terms of teaching. And a lot of these challenges really do relate to both money and funding and other types of resources, which maybe we can kind of talk about a bit more. But paying more attention to games, and those who are already studying and engaging with them and also making them, and those who are playing them, is something that needs to be done to move games and their ephemera from the margins of our practice in digital history to think more about the sort of imaginative possibilities that doing so might create. So yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wright. Terrific. Okay, well, we have about 20 minutes for questions. And are there any questions in the audience or on the chat?
Well, this is a question for Professor Wright. In your studies, have you looked at what do people who play video games know about the history of the topic of the game? In other words, so if we know that, then the intervention of the professor would have to adjust on how the professor approaches it and teaches history to compensate for the different affordances and lacks.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's really important in terms of thinking about like actually our pedagogy when we use games in education and use them to actually engage students with history, but also in terms of until relatively recently, there has been some work that's kind of been done more recently on this, but historians, kind of researchers actually asking players what they thought about historical games was sort of not done as much as kind of historians making judgments themselves on games. So yeah, there is increasingly work that's been done to sort of understand exactly what games represent as an entry point into people's, or as a kind of a jumping off point or not, into people's existing kind of historical knowledge and awareness about a particular topic, or more broadly, their understanding about what history actually is or what history could be. So yeah, and often, sort of this kind of work is finding that these communities and the way that they interact with games, they do so in ways that they see themselves very often as very kind of learned. They do actually make judgments about games. They often modify and work to modify games in such a way because what their perspective is on a game is very different to the kind of historical representational argument that a developer is making. So that's in terms of, I guess, kind of like broader gaming communities, that they do actually feel like they are an active kind of participant in the kind of construction of history of games. When it comes to sort of your role as the kind of the teacher or educator in that space, it's kind of something that you always have to sort of calibrate and do from the beginning. Like when I teach historical games to my undergraduate history students, it's very much from a starting point of, okay, so how many of you play games? What is your kind of like experience level in understanding both how games work, but both, how games represent the past? And a lot of it is to do with not just kind of understanding their level of kind of historical knowledge on certain topics, but even trying to encourage their kind of critical literacy to sort of unpack these kinds of terms like authenticity and the way that they're often used and the way that they students will use these terms to describe games is so kind of fluid and varied, and really what I sort of try to do, and what I think it's really is an important and useful games can be used to do in historical education, is to kind of promote that sort of general critical literacy in terms of thinking about how arguments are made, and how the kind of how these representations are actually constructed, and what it is that they are telling us about the past, if that makes sense. So yeah, thanks. It's a good kind of question about sort of people's experiences.
Sorry, do we have a question from the chat? We do not have a question from the chat. Okay, Aviezer?
Thank you. Just some doubt about the utility of the chat box in testing theories in philosophy of historiography. Isn't it the case that just like thought experiments in philosophy, they would just illustrate intuitions rather than test them? And the case of the counterfactual historiography at the end just kind of shows that you ask the program to do something, it does what it can, it doesn't test it. That is, can you ask the chat box, write a historiography of the Battle of Gallipoli without making any description, or without having any narrative, or without making any argument, or can you test if those really is a give and take there? Write a historiography of Gallipoli that is both descriptive, narrative, and makes an argument. It just seems to be illustrating a theory rather than testing it.
I think that's for you, Professor Kansteiner.
Yeah, but that's the point. I mean, it becomes look, at this stage of the chatbot, nothing is, there's so many problems, ethical problems and other problems. But what actually becomes interesting when you try comparing the results to historiography that exists, and the kind of history writing that we find valuable, and to take this as an exploration, to look at it side by side and see how genre and how different objectives are actually informing texts themselves, that is, their internal structures and their internal functioning of texts, as well as their communicative functioning. So it allows us to play the possibilities of grammar, of meaning making, that we cannot ask any historians to do. We can't ask our doctoral students to say, I mean, you're writing now 3 different dissertations about the same event, perhaps using the same sources, and we'll see. One of them is narrative, the other one is assertive, the last one is more descriptive. That would be great, but that's unethical too. So in that sense, it's the going back and forth where you're absolutely right. It's about illustration. It's about possibilities of exploring genre, because, and again, many of these things are intuitions. It seems to be, as Ethan has also said in his introduction, it seems to be that the large language models learn genre very well. And that is apparently because in the texts that they are digesting, maybe not digesting, but ingesting, genre seems to be very predictable, because it's about probabilities. And they seem to be able to perform because their feed is very much genre sensitive, or how you would phrase it. So therefore they can predict genre. I find that very intriguing. And I'm after, and of course, it's in that sense, it's still a metaphorical relationship, clearly, and it's not anything that would satisfy hard science in terms of having a hypothesis and testing it. Absolutely not. But in terms of illustrations, in terms of mirroring, in terms of also understanding how genre works in the texts that the chat bots have digested, is actually very interesting. And of course, it becomes all the more interesting if we get the possibility to feed our own chatbot. If we can have a history GPT, I don't know what, then it becomes interesting. When we can decide what kind of text should be part of it. And that's a difficult decision, because many of the old history, we don't even want to be part of it because it's so ethically problematic. But be that as it may, then it becomes very interesting. In other fields, In other frontiers of artificial intelligence, that question of ethical curating is already very important, especially when it comes to visual learning machines. In ours, it's also important, but we basically need a lot of money to create our own. And then we're in the business of actually exploring and playing, not with the terrible texts that ChatGPT has ingested, but then we can play with structures, with genre of our own making, and then it becomes even more interesting, and then it becomes less metaphorical and maybe closer to testing hypotheses.
Great. Let's take a question from the chat, please.
Could historical empathy and its development among the players be the theoretical and practical entrance point of digital games to history as a discipline and history teaching?
Yeah, this is a good question, and one I think that a lot of people have been thinking about sort of quite critically. I think the idea of the sort of games as kind of empathy machines, or as kind of things that sort of create empathy, and sort of some of the interesting possibilities of that, but also some of the problems about that when you're talking about kind of sort of more difficult kind of historical and kind of contemporary topics that games sometimes try to engage with. But I think definitely there's been a kind of a broader trend in terms of making games specifically that are less of the kind of mainstream games that I'm sort of talking about necessarily, but games that are made particularly more by historians or with historians or for particular educational uses, that are trying to sort of offer perhaps indeed sort of empathetic entry points into understanding sort of different kinds of perspectives on a historical topic. Games that are trying to deal with more kind of complicated or perhaps underrepresented sort of aspects. Like in particular, for example, there's a huge overrepresentation of mainstream games that are about war, particularly the Second World War, but a lot of them tend to be your kind of shooter games that are really sort of privileging kind of frontline experiences of being a combatant, and that's a very, very particular kind of story that gets recycled and repeated over and over again. Games are increasingly trying to move away from that in terms of offering more kind of non-combatant experiences, of looking at different kinds of experiences of war, to kind of complicate this kind of repeated picture, and to move away from some of these kind of general assumptions about what the Second World War actually was, for example, as a very, very basic example in this case. So I think, yeah, there's definitely kind of arguments to be made about how games can, because of the way that games tell stories and allow us to participate in those stories, how could they perhaps help us to understand the kinds of aspects of the past, or the kinds of stories that maybe don't get told in ways that feels much more personal to us, and kind of gives us this more kind of experiential sort of understanding of what it might have been like in ways that are perhaps not been visualized before. Yeah.
Okay, any questions from the audience first? Shazad, and then we'll go to the chat. And we have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So this is a question for Dr. Wright. As I was listening to the description of games, what they bring up and how they're being processed, there seems a fairly close parallel to historical fiction, which of course has been around for much longer. But I can also see some differences in terms of feedback loops and the ability to find pathways on an individual basis within a complex thing, whereas the novel would be coming all at once to one. So I'm just curious as to how that fits into the study of historical games, and whether part of the architecture of gaming is actually coming from historical fictions and not so much from academic history, or not.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's some really interesting ways that kind of lots and work done by kind of people like Adam Chapman in historical game studies, are trying to kind of map the broader kind of theories of history, and of people like Hayden White, like we've been talking about in this panel anyway, map on to kind of what it is that games do with history and do with scholarship and the kinds of modes of representation that they have in terms of how they represent the past, and how even those forms of representation and the forms of interaction and action that games allow for, how they correspond to different even epistemological positions in terms of, you know, games that are offering a more kind of realist representation or simulation, I should say, I guess, of the past, being more of the kind of reconstructionist sort of epistemological stance, versus games that are more perhaps conceptual and a kind of more strategy wargaming kind of games that are more kind of constructionist in their sort of epistemology. So there's definitely some interesting ways that games are perhaps unconsciously or consciously sort of drawing on sort of the actual different practices of history, or different ways of understanding or thinking about theoretically what history, or philosophically perhaps what history is, and different games that are offering sort of insight into what it actually means to do history. But undeniably, so much of what games are doing with the past, and just in terms of the way they have to construct these very often huge and very intricate and detailed worlds that have to allow a player to kind of explore in a completely non-linear way, to, you know, to within limits, obviously, that they have to allow for lots of different kinds of interaction and putting things together. It requires a sort of level of knowledge about the past and sort of intricacies of detail about the past that we don't even necessarily have as historians in terms of what things look like. And it almost always will include some kinds of fictionalizations and inventions, for even sometimes for the just reason of making a better game, whatever that means, rather than it being a kind of a good history. These are the kinds of questions that, you know, designers are always kind of grappling with, in terms of what does it mean to make a game historical versus what it actually means to sort of write history. So yeah, and I think that's partly why sort of a lot of what's kind of theoretically being written about historical games is sort of drawing from wider traditions around historical fiction, because it's very rare that any sort of historical digital game won't include fictionalized places, fictionalized people or events, even if they are still trying to claim a level of authentic representation of the past. So yeah, it's a really good question, and sort of interesting thing to think about how they're still trying to claim this level of realism, but while still really sort of heavily relying on the traditions of historical fiction.
Should we take one more? Last one?
The wrap-up session is scheduled to begin at 3 p.m. and it's 2:32, so perhaps we have time to take the remaining 2 questions that are online.
Sure, go ahead.
Great. This one's a little bit lengthy. It's from Haley Price. Professor Wright, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I am a first-year PhD student at Brown and also a historical video game developer. Your talk highlighted how game developers and historians have very different ideas about how to do history within the medium of video games, which I have found true in my own experience as well. As one of the very few people I know of who bridges these 2 disciplines by making historical games myself, I wonder about the role of historians as game developers themselves. How do you see historians as potentially working on games for research, or more obviously for pedagogy? What might our role be, and how might we do this in your view?
Oh, wow. That is such a kind of fundamental question in lots of different ways, and kind of, you know, what I was sort of saying in answer to the previous question about how do we negotiate, and sort of what is the negotiation point between what a game requires to be a game and what traditionally we've thought about what a history needs to be a history. Yeah, I think, God, I don't even know. It's I think games for research and games for pedagogy, they can be sort of, they can be, and they sort of often are different things, but they are so sort of entwined that it doesn't, any game, and people kind of working in historical game studies have argued this in different ways, any game can be used in a kind of pedagogically useful or interesting way, even if it wasn't built to kind of be pedagogical or to be used for education, because it's about how do we use any kind of game, whether a mainstream game or an educational game, how do we use that to kind of still kind of offer or allow kind of give access points to history students to unpack, these kind of broader questions about what history is. I think it comes back to this kind of question, sort of the broader point of kind of what we're asking here and sort of in the symposium generally about what sort of things does doing history digitally and doing history in a kind of digital game way allow us to do kind of imaginatively. How I think there are big questions to be asked about moving away from being wedded to certain expectations about what history is, and also certain expectations about what games have to be, to create things that can be a bit playful with both. That's not particularly a great or sort of well-formed answer, I know, because I think we've gotten the games industry, mainstream games industry, and even kind of educational games to an extent, have got kind of entrenched in these particular expectations that a popular, fun, and interesting game has to do certain things. It can't be historically sound. Games like Pentiment, I think, are doing sort of much more interesting things with this. There are increasingly games now that we've moved away from the expectation that every historical game has to be a kind of Call of Duty or a Red Dead Redemption, perhaps. Games are, I think it's much more about taking risks in terms of what we think is going to be kind of popular, to do things that are more interesting and to be more kind of creative and playful with the notions of what a good historical game has to be and what it has to allow us to think about. So I think, probably not a great answer, but I think this, having a level of kind of critical reflection and kind of allowing ourselves to think beyond what has come before, into what we would want a game to be and a game to do, in terms of both expressing our research and allowing us to teach people things about history in a kind of digital age, are the kinds of questions that should be driving what we're doing in terms of our practice and thinking about and using games, I guess.
Last question.
Thank you. This is from Apostolos Spanos. Is there any work done on simulation modeling as a method of doing research in history?
And who is the question for? No. Well, whomever would like to take the question, or perhaps repeat it.
Oh,
Should
I'm
we
sorry.
repeat the
Sure.
question? Yeah.
Is there any work done on simulation modeling as a method of doing research in history? To anyone in the audience?
Both Kansteiner, do you have anything you want to add?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it pertaining to counterfactuals?
Adrian
perhaps?
Curry, in his recent book, has worked on simulation in archaeology and natural history. So, how the dinosaurs run, how buildings could have been built in the ancient world. These are all computer simulation. They run algorithm based on laws of, how animals run, whatever, how buildings can stand. And that's definitely quite a lot, both in natural history and archaeology.
Okay, well, I think all that remains for us to do is to thank our panelists, Dr. Kansteiner and Dr. Wright. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is always my favorite part of the conference, when you're just, everybody's mind is already on a glass of wine at the reception or a martini at the bar. And yet we all also feel compelled to try and, return to the topics we've discussed and see what, if anything, we've learned. But really, in this instance, I think what I'd like for us to do, what we'd like for us to do, is certainly allow the participants who have been zooming in to have a chance to ask questions to any of the presenters, because now we've had a time to reflect and think, or to make their own statements or present their own ideas, not extensively, but to a point, so that we can hear what they have to say. And then, of course, just to open a general conversation among all of us. In some ways, the hybridity of it in most of our history and theory events, at the end, we all just bring everybody together in a room and everybody just sits around and talks. And now, of course, we're trying to negotiate video capture and we want to get everything on mics. So it makes it a little sort of less homey, but I think, we've been functioning so far and I think we'll continue to do so. I'm not sure whether Joe or Shahzad, you want to add anything to that? No? All right. Well, then maybe we'll we can start by sort of seeing if there are any statements or questions either from online or from in the room. But I'd say we would prioritize people who haven't spoken yet first. We'll prioritize non-presenters first, and then presenters can certainly extend or clarify or ask questions of each other. So.
Just first off, thank you to everybody who's been organizing and presenting at this incredible conference for the last couple of days. I really appreciate it. One of the things that I think was touched on a lot with conversations about visualizing this sort of digital scholarship, with the question of the reader, which has kind of been on my mind going forward, is the sort of experience that people get while engaging with any of these forms, right? Whether we're talking about an analog book or a piece of digital scholarship, it's always an embodied experience, right? So it's not just the person viewing this sort of thing, but when a book, for example, gets marketed a lot, like even in fiction markets, there's a sort of aesthetic cultivation in a lot of informal marketing for people who kind of want to say that this is what it means to sit down with a book. And I'm thinking also of Meltem's question about just reading and writing and the pleasure of reading and writing, which is a driving force for a lot of people who engage with this material, both on the production and consumption side. And so I was wondering whether I could just open the floor a little bit to anybody who wants to talk about it from the presenters, about how you reflect about the embodied experience for somebody who engages with one of these digital forms of scholarship, right? Not simply the aspect of like visual navigation, but what it means to actually sit down and consume a piece of digital scholarship, whether or not there's a difference between that and analog stuff, because there is always somebody kind of sitting down and having an embodied experience with any of this work. Thank you.
So that's great. It's a fantastic question. Also a logistical challenge, because I hadn't thought about how to manage a question to all the panelists. But maybe we can see whether anyone wants to volunteer and speak up, or I guess the best way with our esteemed virtual colleagues is to pop up a hand so we know you want to say something. I hope someone will want to say something. Well, Laura wants to say something.
Thank you. What I will just say very briefly is that one of the characteristics of digital work is it's dynamic. And not that a book isn't dynamic and that you're turning the pages, but oftentimes you get a charge out of seeing a result pop up, right? You've queried something and all of a sudden you have an answer, and there's a bit of a charge involved in that because you are the one directing that in querying a particular way. Now, obviously this can spool out in all different kinds of manifestations of digital work. For example, if you have chat or you're interacting with somebody else, right? There's that kind of adrenaline charge that I think is a little bit different in terms of embodiment than other kinds of historical research. So I just say that.
I guess having sat through many discussions about this at the centre, for me this is a hardware question. I'm sitting here today with an iPad instead of a laptop. Our vision of engaging with the digital used to be, you had to sit down at your computer at a screen. And so it was a very particular sense of an embodied experience, and one that was often contrasted to reading a book. A kind of inflexibility about how you had to do it, and lots of judgments about what looking at screens did to your eyes, and students telling you they didn't like to read things on screens. I'm just really struck by the fact that none of that actually really applies and makes sense anymore. For better or for worse, our digital content has at least the potential to travel around on all kinds of devices, and therefore be kind of the embodied experience of engaging with it actually has probably moved closer to reading a book. Now, the big caveat, having sat in on those meetings, is that responsive design is not easy or cheap, and actually building something that really can be used like that is tricky. Nobody in the business of digital history wants to be building apps because Apple breaks them every upgrade, and that's the ultimate sustainability challenge. And generally speaking, most of those apps for the kind of digital history things are just glorified links that open the browser, but actually nobody wants to open a browser on a mobile device anymore. So you end up having to build something like that because they won't go to their browsers. And we had a very successful project at the Centre on the histories of the National Mall in DC, where they built an app like that because they could not get people to go to the browser. So I think that's a really interesting question, but I think what's really interesting about it is that the experience is changing, because of course here I'm also moving things by touching the screen. You know, the embodied experience is getting closer and closer in some ways to that. And as somebody who now reads most of my fiction on an ebook, you know, this has surpassed the book because I can read it in bed at night without having to turn the light on and keep my weight away because the screen lights up. So I think there used to be a hugely charged debate about that, and that I haven't heard much about recently, but your question actually reminded me that is because, in fact, we're closing that embodied experience a little bit, unless we want to do perhaps some of the things that Silky does in some of those immersive environments where maybe, you know, we're sticking on headphones and goggles and stuff like that. But even then, you know, those are often available in this mobile world we live in.
So we can hear from, I think, Zilka and then Wulf and then Christian. It could all be in German.
Thank you so much for everything, and also for that question. And I'm basically just kind of adding to what Stephen just said, stressing the fact that even the interactivity that we sort of connect with all things digital is subject to change. I mean, the things that I've shown are basically trying to use embodied experience in a more sort of obvious way, but then that is sort of just one direction to go. And I just wanted to add like one thought. It's not only the embodied experience. Stephen, you just said, you know, you're touching the screen and all that kind of thing. And it also does something with, I think, the mid to reality, or the sort of the kind of objects that we interact in digital space. Like, for example, in our virtual reality realm, one of my coworkers, he's designing digital 3D representations of objects that you can move in different ways and other ways than you would be able to sort of handle it in its real materiality. So I think there's lots of ways to sort of go with this kind of interactivity in the future.
Wulf?
Yeah, I think what's so amazing is the spectrum is so wide. You know, the spectrum of interactivity is so wide. You know, from an extremely immersive in VR, AR environments to a kind of, you can almost call it maybe a simulation of very classical dialogical settings, and that's at the moment the language-focused AI experience seems to be a simulation of very old forms of dialogue, so yeah, that spectrum and the possibilities in that spectrum, and to not only to place yourself with a device on that spectrum in any kind of combination, that's absolutely intriguing, and it seems to be also that the absence of interactivity and the absence of immersive qualities makes it, in terms of media history, extremely difficult to reach people. So there's maybe a price to be paid for that. That cannot be. It's almost you're maneuvering yourself into a type of media ghetto where communication about any topic, including communication about relevant pasts, becomes very difficult. And that's a price to be paid for not just historians, but also historians, if they insist on their traditional forms of mediating the past. I think it's basically, historians can't afford that. It doesn't work. It doesn't seem to work intellectually, and it doesn't work in terms of communication.
Thank you, Wulf. Christian?
Yeah, thank you very much for this important question. I would say if the interface and the user experience is well made, then I think this notion of readers exploring contents and finding their own stories and histories works, at least from my experience with bodies and structures and a new vision of Islamic pasts. I think what motivates, or what can motivate readers, and it worked with me, is that you are motivated to click through the contents because you have this impression of collecting information and finding new pathways through a set of possibilities that is offered to you. And I think this is something that you can really rely to, because you have the impression that it's in big parts also your story that you are accessing there. And of course, from project to project, this is different depending on the functionalities that are implemented. But as another example, Bodies and Structures has this lenses feature that was developed by the Scalar team in cooperation with the Bodies and Structures team, that lets you curate your own selections from the whole website. So you can collect pages by your own predefined parameters. So you have a query function, and then you can select, I want to have all the contents that are marked as being contextualized in colonial contexts. Then you want to have primary sources with thematic tags of borders, maritime borders. And so you can collect your own set of primary sources on maritime borders. And this is something that is very engaging and gives you the impression of being a very active reader and a user of this website. And so I think this has a lot to do with, and we heard that from Wulf, with the challenge of implementing a good user experience, which is hard because we have to be more savvy in those questions, of course. But on the other hand, we have learned that for our cultural techniques we are used to, writing scholarly text also. So writing text doesn't come from the sky. We don't do it just by that, but we have learned it in our studies as well. And I think this was also one of my questions earlier. We have to train students, we have to train the trainers to be more savvy in those new forms of writing and creating.
Thank you. So Allison, yeah,
Just
and then
a
Jesse.
contribution to this conversation and also the previous question on simulations. There's another project in our portfolio that was mentioned yesterday, Shadow Plays, by Professor Massimo Riva here at Brown, which looks at 18th and 19th century Italian analog devices that created augmented worlds. And so he has a series of 8 simulations that are extremely immersive. They're embedded within the chapters. This is a Scalar project, but they're also clustered together in a separate part of the publication. So the reader can go directly to these simulations. They're very engaging. One could spend a lot of time within these simulations, and post-publication, he is now working to create a fully immersive headset type immersion with a number of these simulations. So he's carrying it well beyond what's currently possible on the screen, which is already a lot. So I would just direct you all to that publication as an example of simulation being put to very good use to advance the argumentation.
Thank you. So we'll turn to Jesse, and then afterwards I want to get to, we have some questions, right? One right now. Okay, so we'll do that, and then we can return to this.
Thanks. I just wanted to, I guess, like say a comment that I did a little bit earlier, but in a slightly different way related to your question, which is about the situatedness of the reader. And I think what strikes me about this moment that we're in is, again, we have the chance to be much more attentive to the readers that we are allowing to have access to certain things that we're publishing, right? So all of those technologies that we've been describing require certain things that are not universal. And so I think and this is not sort of a condemnation of the moment that we're in, because, technologies of knowledge exchange have always been limited in their universality. But I think we're in a particular moment where we can at least be more self-conscious about the sort of situatedness of the readers who we are implying when we sort of push the envelope on sort of VR technologies as a way of being universal in one way, but then sort of, only speaking to readers who are going to have access to that in another. And that strikes me as a really important thing about this moment. I wanted to ask a question for Marnie, that then a sort of specific version of it for you, but then I hope one that a bunch of people will be interested in addressing. So in your paper, in your talk, especially in your talk, you left us with this sort of, for me, it was, I started in my notes as this, I really want to hear you say more about it. The sort of provocative idea that, looking at the computer scientists who are working with, the sort of artificial intelligence, you proposed in conclusion that this was not a computer science question. It was a historical question. It was a question for historians. It's about historical data. So I wanted to ask if you could sort of expand or reflect more on exactly what you think then that means. So what should we be doing with your provocation? And then for the my fellow panelists or attendees more generally, right, like what is unique about the sort of the DH moment for history that is not present for other disciplines? Because one thing that struck me about this is we've constructed this conversation between people not to call out Courtney, but sort of like almost everybody in the room is a sort of like a minted history PhD, right? But we very much could be having the question about digital history with a room full of people also in literature, in art, in archaeology, all of whom study pasts and sort of reconstruct those pasts. So is there something unique about the history moment that we're in with this digital thing, or should we really be, in fact, not being so disciplinary? Because I think, Marnie's, this is how it relates to my question for Marnie's, because you made an interesting case that there are aspects that it is important that it's historical thinking with certain aspects of things like AI data. In certain cases. So yeah, I hope that's clear as a question for everyone.
Yeah, they really
Happy
hate
to
your
pick that
question,
up.
Jesse. Yeah, please do, Mari. You guys all disappeared for a second, and we thought it was a moment of protest by all of you, but apparently not.
Well, we were taken down by the data overlords. Good morning, and Jesse, thank you so much for your question. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to hear the papers in the middle of the night. I think there's two immediate things, Jesse, that strike me that could be very helpful, because I'm conscious that while we may see and think this is very sensible, we've got a couple of groups of people that we need to work with that I think are really critical here. And I don't mean students, I think we can work with them. The first are our fellow historians. So what is it that we could possibly do to help them to see, to move beyond the idea that this is something being done to them, to something that they can see themselves really productively in and participate in? And I think the code of conduct is the most vexing issue at the moment. So I do think that we can provide practical advice, very practical advice to historians everywhere about how it is they might be thinking about those published codes of ethics, how we could give advice to peak bodies about ethics, but also when people are producing course outlines, they are often writing things about plagiarism or about co-optation of information. I think we could be providing some very practical advice for people to think about how to deal with these challenges. So that's our first group. And I think that really turns around the notion of, theoreticians doing something dreadful to them to actually theoreticians doing something extremely helpful for them. And this is a good moment for that. The second is potentially more radical, but I think appropriate. And that's actually to suggest that we have some industry roundtables or discussions like this with industry. They are actually really interested in this stuff. I can give you an example. About a month ago, I sat on a panel organised by the local cemeteries, and it sounds very strange, well, but it isn't actually. They are really interested in providing avatar services for people because people are asking for these things in advance care orders. They want to have an avatar of themselves after they've died. And these cemeteries were saying, well, this is a really great idea. And I said, well, it is, but perhaps, Granny might have been a horrible person. Do you really want to promulgate her? And if you machine iterate, learn your granny, when does your granny stop being your granny? And of course, the poor cemeteries were thinking, oh, goodness, this is not something that we had really thought through, although they are really exploring things like immersive technologies, AR, VR, QR codes to help people to deal with grief and to think about the people that they really love. So, Jessie, there are actually industries and actually industries as well. So Facebook, the big ones. DeepMind yesterday released a string of ethics papers, which was really interesting, but none of them were history papers. So there's just an opportunity, I think, for us to reach out to some industry partners and say, there's some really interesting stuff here that we think what we could do is produce some short rapid response papers for you. We could produce some practical question papers. What are the questions that are vexing you about this, or what are the questions that vex us? And can we produce some advice in some shorter open access versions, but also use History and Theory and other platforms, great platforms like this, to help you to understand the things you're dealing with. Because otherwise we end up in a situation like I talked about yesterday, which is they don't want to go near things that are too dangerous, and that ends up with some really, really anodyne history as a consequence. So, Jessie, I hope that's a helpful answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marnie. I want to just table the general question for a second so we could get the question from one of our online visitors on the floor, and then we can come back to it. So.
Thank you. This is from Apostolos Spanos. Thank you for an excellent symposium, and thank you to all the participants for really stimulating papers. I would like to share two thoughts. The first is that we focus, as it is logical, on the textual and visual dimensions of historical research and narratives. Digital history gives us an incredible possibility of doing all senses history. The second thought is that our discussions on digital history should include non-historians, not only because we have a lot to learn from colleagues working on AI, big data, modeling, computer learner interaction, and many more disciplines, but also because we have a lot to offer them in terms of source use and criticism, narrative structure, storyline construction, theory development and implementation, and methodology. I would be grateful for any thought on these issues by any of the participants or from the audience.
Well, that's a great intervention and a great question. I think it dovetails with the one that Jessie was asking as well. And it is a question about who's in the room and who's not in the room. I suppose part of that is self-selection, who shows up and who doesn't show up. But I do think we could turn, I know Zilka and Wulf wanted to respond to Jessie, but I imagine this question or provocation can fold in, and then we can open it up to the floor and take it from there. So let's start with Zilka.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also to the question in the chat, I think it actually fits nicely to the kind of things that I wanted to say to Jessie's question. So maybe I'll start with the all senses idea. I mean, olfactory is still a problem. I think, I cannot really smell in VR, but I think what we can focus on more and where I've been part of an interesting study or an interesting idea for a research project is auditory or, use sonification, for example, in order to go ahead with these kinds of pattern recognitions that we usually do in text mining, for example. So one of my future projects that I'm imagining is to use sonification to track authorship, try to see, how does Goethe sound in sonification compared to another author, for example. So I think we can actually do quite a few things about auditory with the auditory senses. Or for example, there's this letter collection of Abelard and Eloise, which is really, I think, quite famous. It's a medieval letter collection where nobody really knows, did Eloise, which is the female part, ever actually write those letters herself? And I think with sonification, you could try to not only read and understand and do the semantic analysis, but try to hear the language in it on a different kind of level. So I think there's quite a few ideas there still left to play with the senses. And then maybe to the second question, I'm part of a project at Bielefeld University on explainable AI and the question of sustainable AI life cycles, where we try to work together with computer scientists who actually develop the algorithms and train the AIs to work in the societal feedbacks that happen after the implementation of an algorithm. And they asked me to be part of that group because as a historian, they asked me explicitly as a historian, because I seem to know things about memory and forgetting, and how these kinds of programs that kind of always, learn in patterns and try to identify the same thing over and over again, would they not to be sort of socially more relevant even if they also learn to forget and make mistakes? I think, Marnie, you pointed out some of these ideas on your paper as well. So I think this is also something where we are explicitly asked to join the table, not only because of our competence in source criticism, but also because we kind of think and theorize a lot about how to memorize, how to learn, how to forget. This also, I think, maybe plays into the whole question of archiving. What do you collect? What do you forget? What do you sort of leave behind? And then maybe the last thought, going back to Jesse's question, and then I just stop talking for the moment, at least. I think that what is also important for us as historians to join the whole discussion about what I call with Felix Staller the digital condition, is to historicize our very moment in the present. What are the conditions that the society operates under? And I think this is something that we as historians learn when we study sort of past societies, and take that knowledge about, how do you model a society, which kinds of parameters are important to sort of understand past societies, to use that toolkit to also sort of work on the specific conditions our present society works under, to have this outside reflection on all the processes that we now sort of experience with algorithmization and the heightened implementation of AI in our everyday life.
That's great. Thanks, Silke. I do want to make one quick reflection on, it's an embodied experience thing that I've noticed at hybrid conferences, is that there's a kind of tyranny of the online presenter. No offense to any of you. It's just that the online people are on a screen facing out, and everyone else takes the passive position of the spectator, which seems to sort of, it really has nothing to do with the people who are on the screens, but it does seem to cause the other participants to recede into a very passive posture. So I'm going to gently encourage our people in the position of the audience, who are presenters, and if they were zooming in would be on the screen also, to pipe up when you will, because otherwise it just tends to tip. So Marnie, I'm nudging. That's what I'm doing. I'm nudging the algorithm here, and we'll see whether it has any effect or not. So, but with that being said, I'm going to turn to Wulf and Christian, who are both on the screen. So, Stephen wants to go. So it'll go Wulf, Stephen, then Christian, and we've solved our problem. So Wulf.
Well, it's good to hear that we're turning into a video game for the audience a little bit, or maybe a film. Very quickly, two things. I think the question that just came highlights, I think, one of the conundrums they are facing, and maybe also a conundrum for digital history. We already have an all senses memory culture, or an all senses public history culture, whatever term you prefer. That is, relationship to the past in society go by a multiple sense experience. history, professional history is not, or only in some parts. And that creates a mismatch that has existed for decades, but that is exacerbated. And it's a question how we want to position ourselves. Do we run after the popular, or do we run into our ghetto, or how can it be done? It's a good question. It's a challenging question. But it is one that in terms of how we experience pasts and with what senses we experience this, the distance is growing and not disappearing. I wanted to highlight, you asked the question, Ethan, about what's the specific about this, what's specific about this moment in terms of the discipline of history. And I think there are a couple of elements that are particularly important to historians, or that make historians particularly nervous, perhaps, or that historians also feel that are particularly important. And that is the digital is a changing relations to two things that are very important to historians: to sources, the things coming from the past, and to time. And maybe both of these registers and both of these elements are more important to our work than to many other academic disciplines. And I think in terms of sources, what we have learned is that so many of the sources that traditionally, the cultural sources we worked with, are now in the digital age easily disappearing. And I think that is very, very troublesome to historians, maybe more so than to other disciplines. And the other one is time. There seems to be a very strange relationship to time going on, for example, in AI. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about at all is that AI is very, very forgetful about the most recent past. Because depending on how you train your large language models, for example, they don't have a memory of the recent. According to ChatGPT, Queen Elizabeth is still the reigning monarch of Great Britain. There's a bizarre, there is a layer of time where the models are stuck. At least that's how it's at the moment. And it's going to be, I think it's a very strange experience to pasts that are here developed. And that's a challenge for historians, I think, to position ourselves and to use them and to live there.
Thanks, Wulf. Stephen? Stefan, I don't know what. I've been doing this too long. I never have.
Sitting next together, we look alike.
I've known Stefan a long time. That's never happened. So it may be that martini is closer to me than further away. Time is collapsing, Wulf.
Well, I was thinking, back to the embodiment question, and I wanted to take it away from, or not away from, I don't disagree with all the embodiment and transformation of technology and how we're interfacing with using technology with various kinds of knowledge forms. But I'm on a campus where they'll build all sorts of widgets that go both in your body and on your body. That is basically a next step of embodiment to what you're talking about. But what I'm interested in the digital then is, in terms of embodiment, is the non-representational. I talked about comics. I'm not doing research on comics, I teach about it. But the fascinating thing about comics is that it brings in the visual as non-representational images, that brings the senses, emotions, experiential into the narrative of the history in ways that really good writers of historical fiction, I think, do. But I myself am not that good of a writer. And I think it's a very hard type of writing to do. And because the internet is becoming so much more visual, which by the way looks like Look magazine, then the question of, can we bring in, my sense of the non-representational is to bring a different kind of ethics into our history that brings the experiential of how people live in these moments that we've described as history. And so that's,
Cool. Christian.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to refer to the second part of the question from the Q&A, because it touches on the broader context of interdisciplinary work. So how to bring disciplines and people from different disciplines together and engaging them in a dialogue and bringing all those perspectives and talents also together. And this is, of course, a debate in digital humanities for a long time, and it has been stressed for a long time that this is in big parts, not only, but in big parts, a problem of proper communication, because we sometimes use different terms, or we use the same terms but in different ways, and we have, of course, our own disciplinary perspectives and ways of thinking. And so this communication problem is really still a large problem. And the question is, how do we tackle that? And one way to do that is, of course, education, the programs at universities that are specialized in training students in digital techniques and humanities, or specifically in digital history. And the other thing is what can be observed, not from, maybe less from a theoretical point of view, but from an empirical point of view. How do these projects in digital humanities actually work, and what works well and what does not work well? And I think this is a task for empirical assessment and observation. And there's a beautiful work by Max Cameron, who did that at the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, who observed that what's actually critical to have not only persons who are interested in the interdisciplinary perspectives of the other disciplinary culture, but brokers, people who are socialized in both words and can translate, so to speak, and broker those topics and test that the interdisciplinary teams are working on. So I think to assess how we could contribute to each other is to observe how those projects actually function and how we can give a better environment for this communication to function, and to place people that can broker those different disciplinary cultures. Because this means that we don't have necessarily to give up our own socialization as historians entirely and become something completely different.
Thank you. So we do have a question or comment from online. I want to get to that. And then Stephen, who I feel compelled I should call Stefan now, but we'll stay with Stephen, and then Shazad, I believe. So.
From Haley Price. Thank you everyone for such interesting talks and points. One theme that has come up frequently is our responsibility as digital historians to change our field by breaking down barriers to DH work. For example, our work being met with confusion, apprehension, etc., by less digital colleagues, or by those deciding who gets tenure track positions and what kinds of publications are appropriate for historians, etc. I would like to expand on this line of thinking. What is our responsibility to make DH work easier / more acceptable for the scholars who come up behind us? How do we support graduate students, for example, as budding digital scholars who are, in my experience, frequently still told our work must fit into older conservative ideas about how to do good history, which seems separate from the digital world? To summarize, how do we make DH more acceptable for early career scholars? Is DH just for those who have tenure and can afford to take risks?
Well, that's going to be a big one. I do want to say one thing, because I think it's a great question. But I think it's a more expansive question. I think it definitely applies to digital history, but I think it also applies to all sorts of genres of writing or topics or approaches that don't get the seal of approval from conventional disciplinary departments. And so it goes to a much broader issue. I do think we should, especially having the group here, focus on the digital side, but I think the pressure shouldn't just be said so that we have all these different nodes of things that have been left out. What's more of it's the question of the boundary building of the center and why those conventions are the ones that are accepted and why it is we have to wait till we have tenure to write the book we want to write or do the digital scholarship we want to do in general. So I think it's a fantastic question, but I think it is one that we should press on the digital to actually get at the bigger issue of this kind of boundary building. So you want to jump there?
I'd agree with that. It's not a unique digital problem. And like a lot of things in digital history, we reinvent the wheel. If you wanted to do women's history a couple of generations ago, you would have had exactly the same problem. The interest of grad students lag behind the interest of their faculty, and that's part of the challenge of finding an advisor and not finding an advisor. And I do, I would say one of the interesting things about that is that seems to be where the nub of the problem is, not around tenure, not around promotion, not around hiring where people introduced that bugbear before. It's, I spent a lot of time trying to find the applicable person who didn't get tenure because they did digital work. They don't exist. But I do think there is a genuine issue about graduate students trying to do work in departments where that work's not supported, and that could be all kinds of work, not just digital. I'd actually kind of like to go back to the earlier problem and the earlier question and Jesse's question, because I'm afraid I've become a serious cynic about interdisciplinary work, and I like Christian's formulation. I mean, ultimately, most of those have not been particularly productive relationships. And I think we've made a lot more progress in digital work when we've returned to our disciplines than when we've tried to forge an interdisciplinary space. And I think those are two different things. And I really just don't believe any longer that digital work has to and can only operate in an interdisciplinary space. And so in some ways, I think that the stakes of that are kind of recognizing that all of those disciplines that study the past do it in different ways. They study different sources and they do different sources with evidence, which was actually, I was going to use as an excuse to go back to one of the things that I think matters. That would be a lot more obvious if we made our process visible. And I think part of what is at stake in interdisciplinary environments and part of what's at stake in bringing on new people and making the field more easy to get into is a clearer sense of what's going on in what we do and making that visible to people. And I guess if I had an extra version of that to throw out, I've been a little surprised that ChatGPT has been as present in this conversation as possible, other than the fact that it's present in our culture, I guess, and people are confronting it. But from a disciplinary perspective and a historical perspective, one of the things that's really striking to me and with my process obsession is that process is entirely absent and hidden and missing in ChatGPT. Right down to the thing that that is guaranteed to send my colleagues digital and otherwise screaming down the hallways. ChatGPT cannot cite its sources. It's functionally incapable of delivering you a citation exactly where something came from. And I think if anything, that's a screaming great place for historians to come in, and a huge statement for us about, if you like, the crisis in our culture, that people are flocking to something that can't tell them where it got its information from. And in fact, even better than that, it'll make up something in lieu of being able to tell you. ChatGPT says that, and yet the culture embraces it anyway. And so process and evidence and where stuff comes from, which is at the base of discipline, is also, I think, a real question that historians could bring to AI if we were actually talking about it ourselves and our own discipline a little bit.
Well, we've stumbled into an epistemological crisis here, so.
Okay, I'll bring it back to something much more mundane than the epistemological. But a couple of comments with respect to the environment. So one, with respect to this issue of graduate students or coming into DH, if a graduate student comes to me and says that I want to do a dissertation that is digital, my concern would not be that it would not be acknowledged. So I think that barrier has gone down. it would be, is there enough time to do something that would be well enough at a level? Because it's much more work. Partly because the protocols have not been developed fully. It's just so much more invention required than writing into a genre of a dissertation. So in a way, that's the other part of it that that in terms of just the practicalities of it. On the question of the physicality of it and the interaction between the book and the body, I think also we're living in a moment where there's a romance of the physical object going on. So the reason we have Instagram books shown is because of the physical book is the romantic object, and people unboxing their books and showing them in various ways. So part of the issue is that the iPhone may be an object of romance or some kind of a computer or something, but the digital book is not the same kind of a physical object that can be romanticized in the way through uses of nostalgia. And so there are really historical processes involved that we are socialized into. But the way out of it, or at least the way forward, is more intensive effort into producing digital work that is aesthetically compelling. So this is something that Christian said, that we have to invest a lot more into produce more of it, greater volume and so on. And then perhaps we can have a possibility of a similar type of someone clicking and putting it on Instagram that I just opened the book.
Well, it's certainly the case that it's more enjoyable to read an analog book with the wonderful font and print and paper than one that's terribly produced and thin and hard to read. The aesthetics are not, they're not immaterial for sure. Did we have a, yeah.
This is an expansion of an idea that a couple of people have said, and I've been thinking about it since Gary's talk yesterday about what Gary referred to as the items of closure in history, right? Which are the article in the book, basically. Although the conference talk is sort of an item of closure as well. And I think somebody, I believe, cited Drecker, that it was the quanta of scholarship, right? The sort of the unit that we produce. It seems to me that there's also a sort of theoretical question underneath this, which is that we think of, we all produce history. We are historying, right? We've had sort of various formulations of that. And we consider it as sort of an individual or maybe in pairs or small groups activity, but not as a sort of large group activity. But if it's something that we are doing as a collective, it strikes me that along Jesse's talk, the lines of that, and I think you mentioned this, that really this isn't a digital problem per se, this is a writ large problem that actually we need to allow or think about a bunch of different types of quanta that all in fact are good for the field, right? Producing data is good for the field. Producing, 500 word small thought pieces, right? There's no journal to do that in, to just say like, well, here's an idea. I don't know what the evidence for this is, but or the 40,000 word essay, which was popular in the 19th century and now is sort of right. Like once we get over about 10,000 words, we better make it to 80,000. There's not much in between the two. But our quanta are fairly limited. And I think this does go to not just graduate students, but sort of tenure committees and like what are the various ways in which we are allowed to show that we have pushed history forward as part of that collective unit that is not simply like, I made this, right? This is my closed item. So that was something that I've sort of been thinking about, hearing these different things and like, what are those quanta that different people are good at, right? I actually feel like I'm good at some of them and not good at things like the book, which I'm not a huge fan of writing, but have done so because it was required, right? But so yeah, I'm almost curious, like what other types of quanta do we want, right? What other types are we sort of looking for? So.
Yeah, that is really interesting in the way it dovetails into something Gary said yesterday about, we could do all these things. There's no technological barrier against doing those things. I mean, I'll say one anecdote. At History and Theory for a long time, we've spent a long time setting up the possibility sort of new and experimental types of articles to come in that would have argumentation that relied more heavily on the visual or maybe the audio or, you know, maps. We weren't sure how we were going to get them published in the analog version of the journal, but we were pretty sure we had the resources and time and will to make them happen, be able to get them up online. And so then we got sort of excited and we reached out to various places and waited, and we've never gotten that what we were sure was coming. We thought there would be an avalanche of new different submissions and we'd be the ones ready to publish them, and they never came. Right. We still haven't. I mean, we had a couple that did interesting things with mapping, but they just haven't. They didn't come, and it sort of was a kind of just sort of a sad realization. It's like even if, and maybe we didn't signal enough. Someone said, "Oh, maybe you need to have a digital history prize every year so that someone will submit. You'll get some essays so that they can get the prize." And we thought, I guess that's an idea, but we don't have a prize for anything else. You know, it seems weird to decide that that's going to be where the prize is, but maybe we do need those sorts of incentives. So even with people sort of with the will and the institutional power to do so, something else is restricting these ideas of moving into either other forms in all sorts of ways, whether it's the essay, whether it's a 40,000 word piece. We can't publish that in History and Theory, but someone else certainly could, or whether it's digital. But this is a really interesting question about the structural impediments. This, I guess, is a history issue, but it probably isn't just a history issue. It's probably a larger academic issue.
Not anymore. I mean, 60 History and Theory was publishing 40,000.
Oh yeah, I mean, we could pay, and we could also publish a 5. We published a lot of essays in the past. That was, I mean, anything was permitted in history, and probably still is in the end. If you wrote a really good 40,000 word essay, I mean, like a really good 40,000 word essay, smashing it, we'd publish it. I mean,
what's your email?
History and I just got, you know, our email. Oh, Marnie.
I was just going to say, those of us who've had very generous careers sometimes put their hand up to be Vice President Research in order to support the changes in culture that are necessary. That's not a requirement that those of us who are senior do administration, but it is one of the opportunities to support early career researchers and mid-career researchers by standing up, putting your hand up. To your question around the journals there, Ethan, there's a really interesting horizontal and vertical integrator here, which are the rankings. So this quantification of research excellence and measure of research excellence is in some ways narrowing down the forms of expression around research to become the journal paper rather than the book, for instance, or favouring things over the what are even called non-traditional research outputs, which are industry papers or creative works. Interestingly enough, though, the rankings agencies are becoming more interested in these things as people have ORCID IDs or they have DOIs. But there is a sense in which if your school is highly ranked, that there's a conservatism around that activity, which is well beyond that of the history school. And it's incumbent upon those of us who work in the spaces around those to remind people that other forms are possible. But if you put a DOI on them and an ORCID ID on them, then the rankings folks will find them. So there are simple things that we can do to diversify and encourage people. And I have to say, we don't have a school of history at my university, but we have a heck of a lot of historians in our school of creative. And they are having a whale of a time because they are not, I hate to put it, sitting always with historians telling them that they can't do what they want to do. They are really, really having fun, but they're doing so in spaces that are not in a traditional history school.
Woof. Well, we're coming to the end. I don't know whether we have other things coming over the transom from online. No. Any last thoughts? Does anyone want to tell us what the answer is in 40,000 words or less? If not, I guess I'm gonna again thank Joe, and thank Allison, Jen, thank Shazad, thank Liz Boyle for all this incredible work. I mean, they, actually made this happen. We got to sit around and talk and float ideas, but a lot goes into this. Well, thank you, Stefan. All right. Well, so thanks to everyone who came in. There's clearly more work to be done. I didn't want this session, actually, we shouldn't have called it a wrap-up session at all. It should be like a launch, because we've opened up a lot of questions. And I think one of the great things is there's like a Venn diagram of consensus and goodwill and support. But it's not clear to me leaving here whether we all want to, move into a more disciplinary approach to history, or actually move out to imagine maybe living outside of history departments is the way to go. Whether we want to be publishing and showing all of our data sets and research and making everything available, or we don't want that because we're much more interested on the aesthetic side and we want it to show up as a beautiful object that does the work for us in that form. I'm not sure whether we're thinking of a world in which sort of books become something completely different, or whether, let me put it this way. I don't know, one of the interesting things and where I found there were conflict, or this was happening both at the same time in a lot of the papers, was on the one hand talking about radical change and transformation, and the other about expansion and a kind of retention of more conservative tendencies. And often this was happening at the same time, which I think is certainly a good thing, because it means that there's most about history, the past, taking it up that we all love, and also something we realize is fundamentally either wrong, constricting, or restrictive, which we do want to change. And I guess the trick for all of us going forward is to actually really be attuned to what the other people said, and especially be attuned to the arguments you didn't agree with, and to sit with them and think about them, and to think about how we can use this and take this to go forward, and hopefully continue these conversations amongst ourselves, but as members of the audience and others suggested, to at least move the conversation out beyond historians, whether we want to keep our disciplinary focus the same, but certainly in discussions about what the past is and how the past works and how we represent it. Surely, I think the bigger the tent, the better, even if it is only to say, well, that's how they do it over here, and that gives me a finer point on how I want, how they do it over there, and a finer point on how we want to do it over here, or maybe I'm going to steal that bit. So on that sort of kleptocratic, kleptomaniacal moment of history is thievery, let's call this thing to a close, and well, head our way out to the reception, where we can think of history as a more what's the word I'm looking for? Simply yes, a phenophilic discipline. All right, thank you all, and away we go.
Thank you so much.